it's my pleasure to introduce Rochelle Terman. She is a SICSS alum from the Princeton site 2 years ago, so she's been in your respective shoes. She also is just really impressive. She won the American Political Science Association Dissertation Award for her dissertation, and she was a postdoc at Stanford for a while. Now she's a postdoc at the University of Chicago in political science. I've seen her guest from the award. And her work focuses on international norms, gender, and advocacy. But today she's actually going to talk about a lot of work she's done teaching computational social science, which, especially if you guys are thinking about putting together workshops, putting together courses, otherwise sharing the information from SICSS. Michelle can help us out with that. So, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me at your workshop. I hope the workshop's been going well so far. Looking forward to getting to know you all better. I am a postdoc predecessing a tenure track appointment at University of Chicago, so I will be here for the foreseeable future. In case I have any Chicago peeps around here, yay! Go Phoenixes. Yeah, so I will be based in Chicago for the foreseeable future. If you ever want to reach out and talk more about anything. So in my research, I have used computational techniques like computational text analysis, mostly survey experiments, a variety of things here and there. But today, I thought I could talk to you about teaching computational social science. So who here, raise your hand if you have taught in any capacity on topics related to computational social science. So whether that's teaching R or being a TA, that's great, awesome. Who here who didn't raise their hand is anticipating maybe wanting to teach something related to computational social science in the future? Okay, awesome. So I have taught computational social science matters in a variety of capacities. It's actually how I got initially interested in computational social science. I was a web developer all throughout graduate school just to earn extra money. So I had some kind of exposure, I would say, maybe to programming and to technology and things like that. But I wanted to kind of learn more, and there was an institute that started when I was doing my PhD at UC Berkeley called the Social Science Data Lab. That started when I was a fourth year in graduate school, I think fourth or fifth year. And they started teaching workshops on a variety of kind of tools and applications. And so I became kind of involved in developing a curriculum for those workshops, and then of course teaching them. After teaching kind of a medley of different topics, I taught Python, I taught Git and GitHub, I taught web scraping, I taught computational text analysis, Drupal, WordPress, kind of a variety of different things. I realized that these really short workshops are great, but wouldn't it be even better if we could get people into a class that taught social scientists the kind of tools and applications that they really need to know for their research. And so I developed a class at Berkeley on computational tools that's still being taught, and I taught a variety of other things at Stanford and here in Chicago as well. And so what kind of motivated all of this? So the dream, at least, and I'm taking this from software carpentry, which some of you may have heard of, is that everyday social scientists and humanists use computers to study things that are too big, too small, too slow, too expensive, too dangerous, or just too hard to study any other way. And so obviously, if you're in this room, you see the potential for these kinds of new technologies and data that have become available. But after getting into it, you might have been disillusioned and realized that every day scholars all over the world waste time wrestling with computers. And when scholars try to get help, they're inundated with unhelpful information and then give up. So thankfully, this situation has been changing, but at least was the case a few years ago. There was a huge need and demand for learning tools and techniques to be able to harness just the immense amount of data that was available. So students wanted to learn these things. they realized that there were new tools, that there were lots of new data, that they could achieve better scholarship and professional opportunities if they learned, Python or R or web scraping or whatever. So there's a huge amount of demand, but at least, again, as is the case a few years ago, the supply was really wanting. So when I first got into this, if you wanted to learn computational social science or computing in general as a social scientist, there were a few options that you could pursue. You could take courses in computer science or statistics. Now, has anyone here taken courses in computer science before? Yeah, so maybe as an undergrad or as a grad student. And so I'm not, sure you're going to, by the way, throughout this presentation, you should feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, want this to be a conversation. But oftentimes these courses in computer science, they're not geared for a social science audience, right? And so they introduce a lot of concepts that are unnecessary for a social scientist. They tend to do a poor job of explaining how computer programming tools might be used by social scientists. And they're also just very resource intensive, especially for a social science graduate student who has a million other classes that she needs to take and get her master's thesis off the ground and do all of these things, right? So another option is that students could take short-term workshops like SICSS, which I think is awesome and great. And there are also these workshops popping up all over the place. So who here has heard of software carpentry? Okay, awesome. So Software Carpentry is a nonprofit organization. It's actually called the Carpentries now because they have software carpentry and data carpentry. That's an all volunteer troupe of instructors that go around to different universities and teach kind of practical software tools and techniques to graduate students. And so this was some of my first exposure, I think, to Python was when I took the software carpentry workshop. So awesome, great. So obviously I can see the value in these short-term workshops, but they're great for fast tracking a particular skill, but they're not going to be sufficient, right? I think it's just really hard to learn Python, for instance. It's really hard to get everything that you need to know about computational text analysis in a few days of an intensive workshop, right? So if anyone here has ever taught those workshops, you know that there's a lot of attrition, right? Because it seems like really great the first couple of days, and then things kind of, the students get busy or whatever, they kind of waddle off. Okay, and then the last option that students had was kind of these massive online courses or textbooks or online resources, basically tools that students could tap into to teach themselves. And so I think that, again, these are really wonderful and I benefited a lot from them. And it's great to be able to take the initiative and teach yourself. But these also have limitations. So self-learning is really time consuming. And it's also nearly impossible without a base level of knowledge, right? Who here has ever tried to Google something and you don't even know what terms to Google, right? You're like, it's the thing. So you have to have a certain amount of baseline information just to be able to Google an error, right? To be able to Google a problem. Okay, I want to do this thing in R, but what do I actually search for to help me get the answer that I need? Or who here has ever picked up a textbook on, I just picked up a textbook the other day on mixed membership models because I was interested in that. But it was so far over my head. It was for professional statisticians, right? And so I think these online courses can be great, but you have to have a base level of knowledge, and you also have to be really, really disciplined, right? To be able to, and I mean, Hugh here, to be honest, is that disciplined. Maybe you are, and that's fantastic. But that you are going to force yourself every day to practice your skills, to take the online courses. That's why, again, the attrition of these online courses just are really, really bad. It also kind of contributes to this term that I like to use called autodidact chauvinism, okay? Which is the belief that because you don't already know a thing, you don't actually deserve to be taught a thing. That if you can't teach yourself and kind of learn the skills on your own, then this is not for you. And I think that's chauvinistic in a way and exclusive. And I just think it's also unrealistic because I think that students can learn and can get the capacity and can benefit from these things if only they had the resources they could use to actually be taught it. Okay, so thankfully, when I gave a version of this presentation a few years ago, and that was it. There was an immense amount of demand, not a whole lot of supply. But now I'm really happy and thankful to say that that has just really changed dramatically over the last few years. So when I had this idea about teaching a class on computing for social science at UC Berkeley, there were a few courses around the country that I could look to as models. One was actually Chris Bales taught a similar course at Duke. There was a course at SICSS-Chicago actually that did something similar, but that was pretty much it actually for my survey. So there weren't a whole lot. Now there are just a tremendous amount of courses that are geared specifically for social scientists to allow them to access the critical skills, computational skills in a classroom setting. So I think it's really important to actually have a classroom setting that provides the structure and the resources to get students to show up every day or every week and do the work and actually learn. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to build on courses that I taught, which I've mentioned. So there's a course at Berkeley. I taught an introduction to machine learning for social scientists at Stanford. And I'll be teaching at UChicago on computing for social sciences. But I'm also going to draw a lot of information and lessons from my colleagues who've taught other courses around the country. And I'd also like to learn from you all if you have this resonates with you. Feel free to interrupt to share a story or lessons. So all of these courses are really different, but I think they all have something in common, which is that they all share a fundamental pedagogical goal. So this is some of you may recognize this graph. It's kind of the graph of knowledge accumulation. And most social scientists who are interested in computational social science start, here. You're just clueless. It sounds cool, but you don't know what you don't know. And then, maybe you start to learn a little bit. You get kind of naively confident. But then there comes this moment where you're just discouragingly realistic. Oh my God, there's so much information. How am I going to possibly be able to get it all under my skin? So the goal, at least for all of these courses, in my view, should be that you want to get students to this place on a roll. So you're not going to, it's unrealistic to expect that the students in a class, a week workshop, a semester-long class, are going to know everything, become experts in the topic, achieve mastery. But the goal is to get them to a place where they can Google what they don't know, or pick up a textbook and understand it, or read online documentation, or pursue that class in statistics if they really want to know more about mixed membership models or whatever. You want to get students up to the point where they can usefully get the information on their own. And so to put it another way, the main goal is to learn to learn. So this is something that came from my syllabus at the class I taught at Berkeley, which is the basic learning objective of this course is to leave with the knowledge and skills required to learn on your own, whether that's through programming documentation, Stack Exchange to online forums, or other courses. This is just, I like sloths, so. Okay. So what about the actual content? So that's the main pedagogical goal, but what is the actual content of these courses? So I think at least, and I probably don't need to convince you all this since you're here at this event, but there's kind of a core curriculum that I think is forming around computational social science. And if you all disagree, then I would love to hear your disagreements. But I think they kind of surround around first some kind of open source tools. So things like Unix, Python, R, Git, and GitHub. When I taught a computational tool class at Berkeley, I taught both R and Python. I'm not sure if that's becoming as necessary anymore because just how the two languages have developed. But I, would love to hear someone disagree. So now at least I say when someone asks me, should I learn R or Python? I usually say learn whatever your discipline is, because I think the goal should be to collaborate with others. But if someone here, feels very strongly that people need to learn Java, I would love to, give them that. So this week has been mostly using R. Is that right? Okay. And do people, when they were trained, are still trained in Stata or SPSS or something like that? Okay, yeah. So at least at U-Chicago, I think there's still a lot of resistance among the methods faculty to try to all get on one platform. I'm pretty open about how I think that has pedagogical costs, like real significant pedagogical costs. But econ uses Stata, and sociology, at least for a long time, used more Python than R. I'm not sure if that's the case. So I don't know. Maybe the dream will be that all social scientists get on one or learn everything. I'm not sure. But at least for me, if I were to teach a computational social science class, this would be kind of where I start. Kind of basic computational programming tools. By the way, let me just make a note about this. When I teach programming, I think it's really important to teach how to program in general, not to teach programming in one specific language. Right. So, and we can talk more about kind of what that means. But I think, again, if the goal is to learn, then if you teach people basic programming concepts, then it'll become easier for them to pick up a language if they need to know a little JavaScript or they need to know a little bit of Python or whatever. And then you can't just teach the tools. We also have to talk about kind of fundamental applications. And so these are some of the applications that I think that students are kind of most interested in when they're taking a computational social science class. But again, for a class like this, you're not going to be able to teach all of these. You're going to have to probably pick a few, and you're not going to be able to teach these in depth, right? And so there's going to be a fundamental trade-off in any class between the breadth and the depth. But I think a good kind of default position is, can you get students to know enough about web scraping so that they can pick up the rest on their own? Can you teach them about online experiments enough that they know at least what the broad survey of this topic is, and they can explore on their own? So for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to talk about common challenges that arise when you're teaching computational social science, and maybe some tools and strategies to address those. So these are just some of the challenges I think that really came up for me, but I'm also really curious to hear what challenges you guys have encountered. So the first, I think, big challenge has to do with diversity among students in terms of previous exposure and ability. So the course that I taught at Berkeley, we had students from a really wide range of backgrounds. So some students came into the course with experience programming in multiple languages, and then others had never used a command line interface before, right? And I'm sure even in this room, you're always going to have a diversity of previous exposure. And I don't like to think of it as some people know a lot and other people know a little. It's just that you guys know different things, right? It's a Venn diagram. You guys have different skill sets. But that's obviously going to raise challenges when you're trying to teach, right? So I kind of have two broad approaches or prongs in this strategy. So the first is prevention. Get really clear what the prereqs for your class are. So don't undershoot, right? There are always prerequisites for a class, always. Even though I like to say that my class, when I taught at Berkeley, had no prerequisites, that really wasn't true. I did expect some students to know some things. There's always an assumption, right? There's always an assumption that I know that you have worked on a computer before, right? I assumed that. I assumed that you knew like what your file system was, kind of. And yeah, so I think be realistic about maybe some of the assumptions that you're making for the students that are coming in. But also don't undershoot the prerequisites, but also don't overshoot. So I see this a lot, where there will be a class in computing or computing, and it will basically say you have to have a already kind of know how to program an R or something like that. Or there's a statistics class, or there's other kind of more advanced class, and they say we are going to expect you to be a fluent programmer in R. When you know that there are going to be students who take the class who don't fit that prerequisite, right? And you're kind of okay with that. This is what I see a lot, and also with job just ads too. Like if you apply to industry, sometimes you'll see. I've seen a job ad requesting 10 years of experience in a particular technology that has only been around for 8 years. And so it's like, okay, so that's overshooting their prerequisites. So why do people do that, either in job ads or in prerequisites on syllabi? I think it's because it's kind of an insurance or a liability waiver. That's what I think is really going on. I think that teachers or employers, as the case may be, say, okay, I'm gonna just expect that you have, are comfortable or confident in R, so that I don't have to deal with you if you're not. I think that's basically what's going on. And I think that's a bad thing to do. Because what it does is it disadvantages marginalized students. There has been a lot of evidence to show that if you say we want 10 things on a job description, just statistically speaking, men and white people will be more likely to apply for that position if they have 30% of that requirements. Whereas women and people of color only apply for that position if they have 80 to 100% of the qualifications. And I think a similar thing happens with courses, that if you make unrealistic prerequisites, what you're not actually guaranteeing that everyone in the class has those prerequisites. What you're doing is you're saying that only the kind of in-group should show up to the class, even if they don't have the prerequisites. Does that make sense? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that realize that the prerequisites that you put on the syllabus are going to have different impact on the kind of students that sign up for the class. And just be honest about that. Be clear about who the class is for. We had in PS 2319 in Berkeley, we had like 75% women and people of color, and me, the faculty member who I was working with, were like, "Wow, that's like, why was that?" Because it was so different from all the other classes. And we think it's overdetermined. There were probably a lot of different things that were going on. There were female instructors, but also we put very clearly in the course description, you do not need to have any previous exposure to computing to be in this class, or we assume no previous exposure to computing. It's not like the class was any more remedial than maybe any other class, but I think just by putting that line, it signaled to students that this was like a welcoming class for beginners. Okay. So be clear about who the class is for. If mention to students that you're not going to be an expert programmer when you take this class. You're not going to get a job in data science when you take this class. And then the other kind of technique to use just as prevention is to give a pre-course assessment, which is basically a survey to students that tries to get their base level of skills, just to make sure that everyone, you can put it in the description, but just to kind of ensure that everyone who signed up for the class would benefit from the class. So if there's a student who has, is majoring in computer science, for instance, they're probably not going to get a whole lot of my kind of intro to computing for social science course. So this assessment is basically just trying to get people's baseline. And the tip that I like to give here is that you should separate skills from self-assessment. So what do I mean by that? I mean, instead of asking students, how confident are you in R, 1 to 7, ask them, could you import a CSV into R and calculate the mean and standard deviation for each column? could you do that easily? Could you do that if you had enough documentation? Could you not do that? How many, instead of asking students, do you know Git? Ask them, how many times have you used Git in the last month? Okay. And then I guess it's just because of this like differential in self-assessment and confidence that tends to be systematically distributed unevenly across the student population. My second main prong is adjustment. So you've done all the steps to make sure that everyone would benefit from the course. You've thought about really clearly about who your modal student is. You've made sure that every student in the course knows what the expectations are, but you still get disparity in background. And so what are you going to do about that? Because that's going to be dangerous because some students are going to feel incredibly rushed and overwhelmed, and other students are going to feel bored. So here are just a few strategies that you could use. One is tiered exercises. So oftentimes in these courses is like a semi-flipped classroom, where I'm talking at you for a half hour, and then you do exercises for a half hour, and then I talk again. So that like exercise time, it definitely involves more work on your part, but if you could have 4 or 5 exercises that are tiered in difficulty, I think that was really, really helpful for the courses that I taught. So I had and I made sure that students knew where you're not expected to get through all of these exercises, but it's kind of like a choose your own adventure kind of thing. For some of the students that maybe had more previous exposure, they could work through some of the more advanced and make them hard, just so they don't get bored. Then we also use the color sticky note system. Are people familiar with this? Some? Okay, so basically how it works, it's a software carpentry. I think they originated it, at least I learned it from them. So you just basically have colored sticky notes, a red and a blue, let's say, and then you say, okay, when you're done with the exercises, put up a red sticky note on your computer. And if you need help, put up a blue. And that just at least shows like real time, okay, how fast are people getting this? Okay, I can move on when 80% of people have their red sticky notes up or whatever. It's a really helpful technique as an instructor. Other techniques that you can use are to put all of the lecture notes and the examples and resources online. I think it really helps students kind of review material, kind of makes them empowered to take learning into their own hands. And then to also use some kind of student collaboration, for instance, on an Etherpad. So I don't know how many people have used Etherpads before. I don't even know if they still exist. Do they still exist? Okay, Etherpad is or used to be like a real-time editing like technology where people could take notes in real time and you can see people typing. So if we all wanted to collaborate on a document together, we could use an Etherpad. And this was great because some of the students who maybe had a question who didn't feel comfortable enough to interrupt the lecture could put their question on the Etherpad. And then one of the TAs, if you do have TAs, could, or one of the other students, maybe the students who had more exposure, could help that student directly on the Etherpad. And so we collected questions that way. We took notes, basically did like a collaborative note-taking with this technology, and I thought it was great. Any questions or thoughts about diversity in the classroom in terms of previous exposure? Similar challenges or, yeah.
So I guess I'm curious about the tiered exercises in a graded course.
Yeah.
Equality and fairness. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. Well, these are not graded.
Okay.
So that's a
theory, right? Like.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. So, the tiered exercises are the in-class exercises that are not graded. But you do bring up an interesting point, which is that in some of my courses, did I have more advanced? I think I had like a bonus extra credit fun challenge on a lot of homework assignments. And they kind of were like extra credit participation kind of grades. So they didn't make a huge amount of difference in terms of like it's not like they disadvantaged the students that didn't do them. Let's just put it that way. And these are also, by the way, I should say, all graduate courses where grades aren't as. That's not true. I've taught some undergrads, but at least for the course that I'm thinking of, they were graduate courses where students are a little bit less anxious about grades. But I do think I think the students really enjoyed. Some of the students really enjoyed and benefited from having like a bonus extra credit challenge type thing on some of the homework assignments that only fit under participation or extra credit grades. Yeah.
Like a half-formed question, but
Sure.
I really appreciate like what you're talking about with like separating out the skills and the confidence assessment. And I've noticed like even when students like, get into the classroom when they're confident enough to come, like there's still a gap in confidence within.
Yeah.
Is there anything you found that's super helpful in like addressing that directly and helping students build confidence?
Well, I'm glad that you asked because the second challenge is low confidence. And so I'll just move on. And other people, we can leave some time for the edit if people have more questions about diversity. Okay, so imposter syndrome. I think we've all heard about this before. Remember that the goal of the class is to grow into self-directed learners, right? But in order to do that, there are actually, I think, a lot of skills that has to go into becoming a self-directed learner. So this requires skills to enable students to assess the task at hand, estimate their requirements, vis-a-vis their knowledge, apply and evaluate various strategies, double check whether their approach is working. So all of these skills are skills that students actually have to learn. They're not born with them. And by even just developing those skills can lead to a lot of anxiety, low confidence. And then the real problem with this is decreased motivation and then they don't actually learn. Of course, obviously having low confidence and having your students be miserable is a problem on its own, but it also leads to problems with the basic pedagogical goal because students need to feel motivated enough to actually take on the challenge. And they can't take on the challenge without having some of these meta skills that I just discussed, right? Knowing, how to approach a challenge, what kind of strategies you can use, where to get help, and so on. I think what was really helpful for this is to address those meta learning skills head on and explicitly. Okay? So we had a lesson on how to read our documentation. Okay? Don't just assume it. Oh, read the help file. How do you read a help file? What information is it telling you? Why? What should you get out of that? How do you Google an error? What information do you put into Google request? What information do you leave out? What do you do, when someone is an asshole to you on Stack Exchange, whatever? Like some of these meta skills, meta learning skills to actually help you learn. I think that's where the real gap is when it comes to low confidence and imposter syndrome. Because it's not just that, I can get to the point now where I don't know something when it comes to R Python, and there's no anxiety that comes up with that. I know where to go and what to do. But I have developed those skills over many years. So you have to address those head on. You also have to address beliefs about learning. Okay. So I say on the first day that to be successful in the class requires 5% intelligence, 95% endurance. Again, this comes out of a lot of research about teaching computer science and STEM and other kinds of things that shows that if students come into a task thinking that this is about endurance more than about natural innate talent, then they're going to have more motivation and do better in the course. And then we just try to address what programming actually is on a practical level. So I think I said in the first day that professional software developers write on average like 10 lines of code a day. I remember reading that somewhere. But I think that actually makes sense to me as like a previous professional web developer, right? Because all of your time is spent reading, researching, debugging, testing, you know, things like that. There's so much else that goes into it rather than just writing, you know, 100 lines of code. I mean, who here, like, you guys are all fabulous in advance. Like, who here just sits to write an entire script without ever looking up something, right? I mean, this is, but, and it seems, of course, very natural to us at this point. But I think students who don't know, who haven't been exposed to programming before, go into a class like this and think that they have to, that if they're looking up resources and they're doing something wrong or something, and they think that they have to like get through the whole script without any errors. But we know, for folks who have programmed for a while, that programming is basically about debugging. Right? That's what it is. So we want to address that really explicitly and say, okay, you are going to, I get the same amount of errors as you guys do, classroom students of mine. But the difference is that I'm just faster at debugging than you are at this point because I've had a lot of practice doing it. Other kinds of techniques to increase motivation, encourage group work. There's just been a lot of studies that show that working together in a more social environment increases motivation. And then also any way that you can balance kind of foundational knowledge with real life applications is going to provide motivation to students because they can see what they can do. I think this is actually a huge challenge. How do you balance this foundational knowledge with real world applications? Because it's kind of like teaching someone how to write a book before they can spell. I think it's actually a really hard trade-off, but we can talk about that. But the basic point is that you want to get them to the what we call the come to R moment. Is that at some point the students are going to want to throw their computer at a wall, and you want to help them get over that wall. Okay, get over that moment. We've all had this, I'm sure, if we look back on our experience programming, right? Is that at some point you just get incredibly frustrated, and then at some point it works. And I don't think I think it's really important not to underestimate the power of that moment when it works for students and their motivation. You just get them through that initial difficulty. Okay, let me just run through the last challenge here, and then we can open it up. The last challenge is basically a medley of things having to do with logistics. So I think maybe this was just hard for me, but I really struggled with this, which was like, how are you going to format the lecture? Are you going to do live coding? Are you going to just go through code that you've already written? What room are you going to have? Are you going to have the room that we had was like a circle, and it was like awful, because it just didn't work. And I much preferred people like in tables or something like that. And I wish that I had a whiteboard, and there was no whiteboard. And there were computer problems. Like everyone had these tiny little Google notebook computers, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with those when you have some crazy error, So all of these things, like, I think they really drag me down. So I think the strategy here is to stay flexible, try to collaborate with students. So ask them, okay, we're doing live coding. Is that working for you? Do you want to try something else? Don't be scared to course correct in the middle of the class. Try to plan ahead. So I had a little bit of resources in Berkeley. So I hired like a Windows expert and just delegated to him all the Windows problems because I can't handle Windows. So that was really helpful planning ahead. Like he was in charge of that, and we collaborated on that. And so and these problems are going to come up, but if you stay flexible, keep cool about it, I just want to make a note that there are all sorts of really wonderful materials that are online now. And one of the things that I really love about the computational social science community is that we're all seem very open about sharing our materials and collaborating on our materials as long as you give due credit. So I've definitely borrowed a lot of materials from other Chris Bale, Matt, Justin Grimmer, other folks, and then kind of give back to the community. There are some other, so don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Here are some other questions, other challenges that I didn't have time to discuss, but that I thought if students were interested, we could, this could get the conversation going, or really anything else that you want to talk about having to do with teaching and learning. Yeah. Sure.
I'm really interested in the question based on of tidyverse.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big question I ask myself.
Yeah, I think it's a fabulous question because I have no idea either. When I first taught R, tidyverse was like just starting. So I taught base R, and then we taught a little bit of tidyverse when it was like Plier kind of stage. And now I have to teach this class on R in the fall, and I'm like really struggling with this because so here's the trade-off: is that I use tidyverse for most of my things. Our personal R programming, I think it's great. I think it really helps my workflow, makes things super easy. I think students really need to learn it. But do you start with that? Because if you abide by the principle that you think it's valuable to teach students programming skills rather than how to program in a specific language, then I think students have to know in the long term, like what the difference is between a vector and a list, because if you, even just to read our documentation, you have to understand if the function is expecting a vector or a list, so that makes me think that, okay, let's start with objects. Let's start with data structures and to kind of teach base R for some of those things and then move on to tidyverse. But then some students say, well, why are we doing all this base R stuff? You're just going to teach us how to do it a different way in tidyverse. So I don't know. What do you think?
I tend to think that some base R is necessary. If only for students to understand why tidyverse is useful or is maybe more useful.
Thoughts on this?
Yeah,
or
no, exactly. Like, I don't know. I feel like that whole framework empowers them the quickest, right?
Yeah.
And so it gets up and running to a point where you kind of look back and there's a huge amount of context now around base R stuff, right? Like if you like delve into it. And so I don't know. It's weird. It's like, do you want to leave after like 14 weeks, 3 days, whatever it is, like being as capable as possible without knowing all the skills. And so sometimes I feel like base R is gatekeeping in a weird way because it's like putting the programming before the actual functionality.
Yeah.
In a way. And so, but I mean, that's only a recent true thing because it's reached this level where it's like you teach data wrangling and Texas data all in the same framework, right? And that's kind of a new thing.
I think there definitely is this trade-off because on the one hand, what I was saying a minute ago, is that you want to teach students the skills to be able to be an R for the long haul, and to read documentation and do all of these things. But then you also, it's really encouraging for students to be able to do something right away. You know what I mean? To make a graph, to analyze data on the first day. And so and if that's your goal, like I know some people who start with ggplot, which sounds crazy to me, but I can see where they're coming from because okay, you see you're making a really pretty graph on the first day. Oh, that's really motivating. So I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. Yeah.
I'm just wondering whether you taught the concept of object-oriented programming when you teach Python, because it's kind of similar to me the base R versus tidyverse thing. Because if we don't know like the concept of okay, we can like understand what method in Python and so on and so forth. So I'm just wondering whether you taught them.
Yeah, so when I taught the course that taught both R and Python, and I have to say that now that I'm on quarter system, I'll probably never get a chance to do that again. But I really liked it. So we taught Python first, which I know other instructors have different philosophies about this. But in my view, most of the students already had some exposure to R. So let's teach them Python in order to really emphasize programming concepts. And so I talked about object-oriented programming I talked about, because you get into, it just seemed necessary to help them understand like what methods were, which was important in Python. So we even talked a little bit about like the weird naming, pointing, assignment conventions in Python, which are a little bit different in R. But I have to say, I'm not sure how successful that was because I think like students were found Python pretty confusing. So maybe I just didn't do a very good job. But I did. We touched on it lightly. Yeah.
Another like
Sure.
quick suggestion about the meta learning of
Yeah.
stuff. I guess you've met like Benjamin Soto in Chicago
Mm-hmm.
within the structure in the master's program in
Yeah.
computer science. I think he has a kind of a interesting principle about asking questions. So he encouraged students to ask questions if they don't solve the problem in like 15 or 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Post question in GitHub or ask the TA or the instructor before they feel really frustrated.
I like that for a couple reasons. One is that there are two kinds of problems I think with students and questions. So one is that they don't bang at their computer enough before they ask a question. So I think again, most of just your practical everyday programming is just trying to like figure out why you're getting this error, and if you look at it enough, try different things, and then you figure it out. And if I just tell you what the problem is, you're missing that apostrophe or whatever, then it doesn't. There's something that happens like with memory and learning. I think is that you don't actually retain it as much as when you like tried out different things and figured it out on your own. So I think sometimes I would get a little bit frustrated when students just get an error. I have an error. It's like, Google that error, figure it out, try different things, figure out what's going on, read the error. I mean, this was like one of the most important things to get into novices' heads was like read the error. The error will tell you things. And some programming like R doesn't have very instructive errors, I think. But the more errors you get, the more you start to build an instinct and an intuition about what went wrong, right? So I think, so I like that principle, like work on it for at least 15 minutes. But then it also helps the other problem, which is that sometimes students will work on it for like days. And it's like, that's too much, So I like that. Like, I think that's a really great principle. Is like work on it for about 15 minutes or 20 minutes and then ask someone. Also, pair programming really helps with this too. A technique that I didn't talk about, but I'll bring up now, which is that software carpentry really emphasizes this, is that when you're working on the exercises, those in-class exercises, that you work with a partner and one person types and the other person kind of looks at documentation, copy edits, things like this, because you're like, I'm missing a square bracket or something, and the other person can catch it. So this is also kind of a technique for that. Yeah.
How do you manage patience during that programming?
Patience
and focus. I thought
like,
a lot, and I feel it's really difficult to imagine sitting next to someone who's typing and just.
Well, this is very short, so we're not pair programming all day. Yeah, we're pair programming in 20-minute spurts. So I think that helps, and you also switch off. So you're not just always the one who's looking over. And I mean, I have to say, like, pair programming, just to be really honest, like in one class I tried it and it just didn't work. So that was the thing, the third challenge. Okay, for whatever reason, this isn't working with this body of students, so you move on and do something else. So I think, like, try it. If it doesn't work, it's not dogma. Yeah. Oh, okay.
So I guess, I'm curious about the slides versus live coding.
Yeah.
Because, there's always that tension between like the live coding, there's this must get everything you're putting down and record it and do it. So there's this more like note taking mode versus like kind of absorbing mode, right? But And so you have this control in the slides about like how everything will be returned to and how the discussion kind of flows. But at the same time, it's not true to form, right? It looks polished and done. You can't see the fact that you're Googling all the time.
Right. So I think you really identified the main trade-off. So again, the software carpentry model like really pushes live coding. Why? Because you see practically what coding is. Oh, I made a mistake. Oh, there's an error. Oh, this is what I did wrong. But they also suggest that you do it with one hand to slow you down. Okay, so that is going to be the main problem is that students can't they're just trying to catch up. So you have to force yourself to go really slow, and so they actually suggest that you live code with one finger. And I think it helps students get into their muscle memory. I think this is also a benefit of live coding is because very often very often students will just copy and paste. And I obviously made a joke about that with the stack copy and pasting from Stack Exchange, and we all copy and paste, and that's just the reality. But there's also, I think, a lot of benefit in getting something into your muscle memory by typing it out. So those are the two benefits of live coding: is that you get a more realistic expectation and vision of what programming actually looks like, and you get it into your muscle memory as a student. The disadvantage is that you're right, students are just like so focused on that note-taking mode that they're not actually listening to what you're saying. And you might have issues with just students catching up, or they fall behind, you're already moved on, and they just kind of so I found, what did I do? I actually tried live coding. It didn't work for me. I'm not saying that it wouldn't work for everyone else. I can truly see the value in it. It's just maybe for me, it just didn't quite work. And so I went through basically like R Markdown and IPython notebooks that were already written out. But then I would live code, like if people had questions or whatever, I just wanted to kind of go off script, then you would live code directly in there, if that makes sense. So I guess it was a little bit of both. And then also students would definitely have to code themselves for the exercises. Something else that I want to say about the exercises in this kind of tiered structure is that this is also something that I learned from software carpentry is called scaffolding. So instead of saying like, okay, here's your exercise is to make a list of, of 20 things and then parse it out, put it in order or whatever, any kind of, subset this data frame, I don't know. Instead of like just telling them to do that, if you could have the tiered exercises, so the first tier is that you actually give them like a fill in the blank kind of line of code. So you're giving them the initial structure and there's a blank in terms of that they actually have to fill those out. So that I think is a really good technique just to get, or like write an algorithm, like in some of the more advanced classes, write an algorithm that takes these PDFs and parses it and creates a CSV or whatever. I think that is a lot. But if you tell people, give people each individual step, or maybe some of the more advanced students, you give them less and less scaffold, less and less steps, then that's also a good way to tier the exercises. So sorry, got a little off script on your question, but I just wanted to rephrase that. Yeah.
At what point in a sequence on these computational methods do you think introducing a project is helpful?
Introducing a project?
Yeah, having them. And when do you advocate for like individual work versus group work?
That's a really good question. So folks didn't hear, when in the sequence would you introduce a project? And then under what conditions, or when do you recommend solo versus collaborative work? So I think the collaborative work I emphasize from day one. I think like for assignments and stuff, it's not at all important to me that students work on the assignments alone, locked up in a room. I don't really see that, because I think programming is such a collaborative thing. And like almost by nature, either you're collaborating with someone from Stack Exchange or you're collaborating with the package managers who wrote that documentation. Like you're always collaborating with people, and so why not collaborate with a real life person who's in front of you? So I really encourage group work for assignments. But let's see. So I think for graduate students, it's a makes a lot of sense to introduce a project at the end of the class as like a final. Because oftentimes graduate students are in that class because they want to further their own research. And they do that through course opportunities. And so why not give them a course opportunity where they can pursue some kind of project that is directly related to their research interests. But I do emphasize, at least in the projects, I don't think I would introduce a project for a week long or a few day intensive workshop. There's just not enough time. But I think for a semester long course or a quarter long course, yeah, have a project at the end, make it small, make it manageable. Put emphasis on them giving a presentation about what went wrong, because I think that can actually be really pedagogically useful. So what I ended up doing for the intro to computing class was that students worked on projects and then they had to create a GitHub repository. And I put a lot of emphasis on like having them write good documentation, having them write really good notes in their code, and so forth. And then they gave a presentation about what went wrong. So I think that was, yeah, it was helpful. Here are some actually the projects that came up for some of my students. So some of the students use this to kind of explore new projects and explore new data. That I think this person ended up web scraping like, hundreds and thousands of data points about Indian elections that ended up using that for his dissertation. So that was really cool. And we also had people already have established projects and then use this class to incorporate some element into it. So I like kind of both models. And all of these projects were solo. But I would totally be open, I think, if a couple students came to me and said they wanted to work on a collaborative project. So that was kind of a roundabout way of saying, I guess, like projects for quarter and semester long, maybe I like having an end project, but with the focus more on the process and less on the substance. Yeah. When?
So, like when do you assign it? Because it's a weird thing where it's like you're kind of motivating to be like, okay, do this, but we only know A, B, and C, and we will know, through Z towards the end.
Yeah.
And maybe you care about Z, but you also want to make sure that you kind of check them because you're like, oh, that's not even possible. Like you can't scrape all that. Right?
Yeah.
Or something like that, right?
So I think that's why I like put. I know some classes where it's like all about the project at the end, and you're working all semester basically for that, and they're like you're almost like expected to do I was like a publishable paper by the end or something like that, and I really de-emphasize that and say make it small. Only start towards the end. So I guess that kind of gets back to your question. So start, make this a 2-week long thing. Don't make this a 10-week long thing. Make it a 2-week long thing and make it like a pilot project. I think that's what I emphasized. So for someone was doing something where they were collecting, I think it was her, she was like collecting, she was in landscape architecture and environmental planning. And she collected images on Instagram's API and like tried to figure out how happy people were around Lake Merritt. So Instagram, not Lake Merritt, you guys know Lake Merritt in Oakland, but this is Lake Merritt. So she like picked out different images from different parts of the lake, and then tried to see like I think it was like where were people happiest. And so I'm saying, okay, so think about getting pilot data and go through each step of the process rather than like you get all millions of images and you go through each step of the process. Does that make sense? So I wanted like longevity, or not longevity, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, like do a little bit of each stage and give me a final product, even if there are problems at each stage that you have to go back to and figure out, you know? So do a small version, do a pilot and make it small, and make sure that there are a lot of problems that we can talk about at the end. And I guess I would say, like, I think that there, especially for an intro class like this, to have a big project that has to be polished, I think has costs. Another project idea that I just want to raise, I know we're running out of time, is for my intro to machine learning class at Stanford, it was an undergraduate and graduate course. So I think having undergraduates do a big project is less pedagogically useful because graduate students need to do these projects to advance their research. Undergraduates like to do projects too, but I'm just saying that they're in the class for a different reason. So instead of doing a project that just wasn't enough time, what I had students do said there were a bunch of topics that we didn't cover. And so I made a list of topics. I formed student groups into like 4 students per topic, and then they had to give short presentations on the topic. So I think that was really helpful because it emphasized this meta learning thing that we had been emphasizing the whole semester. Okay, now you have the skills to go figuring out what bagging and boosting is. Report back. Tell us when it's useful. Tell us why we should be doing it. And it kind of gave them like a trial to do the things that hopefully they would be doing after the semester was finished. Are we out of time, or can we just take?
I think that's time, but Rochelle said she was going to stick around for about an hour. So if you signed up for a lunch slot, just shift those by an hour. And if you didn't and want to join the conversation, I'm sure that's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks.